Welcome, everyone. This is Dr. Joseph Orozco. I am a professor of philosophy at Oregon State University, and I'm also the co-director of the Inares Project for Alternative Futures at OSU. The Inares Project is a forum for conversations, initiatives, and projects that imagine a future free of exploitation, domination, oppression, war, and empire. And one of the projects that we conduct is this one, which is conversation with scholars, organizers, and social change agents about how to make radical social change in the world, and particularly in the United States. And I'm very excited to have some very special guests today to help us think about the possibilities of racial justice in the United States. In the past 6 months, we've seen explosions of social movement all across the nation with solidarity around the world surrounding the murder of George Floyd and other African Americans in the United States. Scholars of social movement protests are saying that what we've been seeing the past 7 months is some of the largest protests in US history, a continuation of some of the movement of the civil rights movement. I've invited two very special guests here to help us to understand the possibilities of social change and what might be some limitations of the ways in which we are talking about race today that we need to contend with in order to make any progress towards racial justice. My first guest is Dr. Tommy Curry. Dr. Tommy Curry is professor of philosophy and the chair of Africana philosophy and Black male studies at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. He is the author of The Man Knot: Race, Class, Genre, and the Dilemmas of Black Manhood, which in 2018 won the American Book Award. My second guest is Jorge Mendoza, who is assistant professor in philosophy at the University of Washington. He is the co-editor of the journal Radical Philosophy Review, and he is the author of The Moral and Political Philosophy of Immigration: Liberty, Security, and Equality. Thank you both for being here. I appreciate your time, and I'm really excited that you would spend some of your very precious time and energy with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So let's just get into this, gentlemen. As I mentioned, in the past 6 months, we've seen a huge rise of social movement activity against police violence and for racial justice in the US. At the start of all these protests in May and in June, opinion polls in the United States indicated that quite a large majority of US Americans were expressing sympathy for the aims and goals of the Black Lives Matter movement. But as the summer has worn on and now we're into fall and there's less media coverage of protests going on, like for instance, it's been now, I think about 114 days of continuous protests in Portland, but the media coverage of a lot of this has dropped off. In the last couple of months, opinion polls have come out to show that support for Black Lives Matter is slipping, especially for white Americans. And idea about defunding or de-arming or demilitarizing police, these kinds of proposals that were very popular, or at least were there was a lot of buzz about them at the beginning of the summer, this is starting to drop off. So given what you know about how discussions about racial justice go in the United States, should this lack of interest in supporting Black Lives Matter be at all surprising to us? What do you all think?
Take that, Mendoza.
The short answer is no. I'm actually surprised, in some ways happy that there was such support. I don't know the exact polls, but there was so much support at the beginning. A lot of these social movements historically, it's funny how we remember them. Everyone thinks that everyone was against the Vietnam War. There was a lot of support for the war. So you think of any sort of social movement, they usually start off as very unpopular. They don't have quite the popularity. But I think there's kind of this dirty trick that's continued on since Nixon, which is to equate a movement for civil rights with criminality, and they've been able to do this again. This is what Nixon ran on in '68 and in '72, right? He said the people who are part of the civil rights movement, they're actually part of part of this criminal element and so forth, and this quick equation, I think in the minds of some folks is easy for them to make, in part because you could be, in theory, in support of the ideals of Black Lives Matter, But then, then you feel like, well, I might have something to lose if things actually change, right? A lot of folks don't see the cops as predators. They see them as, well, for the most part, they kind of keep things safe for me so I can go to the store and so forth. At the same time, though, and I don't know what to make of this, I've been seeing and it could just be, I think it's more than just they don't want their windows broken, but some of these chain stores, some of these like big corporate stores have, hashtag BLM on their windows. The NBA has Black Lives Matter on the basketball court. So I'm seeing support for Black Lives Matter in some areas that I didn't think I'd see in 2015 when sort of the first iteration of Black Lives Matter started. I wouldn't have imagined some of these chain stores or the NBA putting Black Lives Matter so prominently for fear that their fans or their customers wouldn't come. So I'll let Professor Curry jump in on this.
Yeah, I can't disagree. I think that the decline is expected. We see this with social movements all the time, especially issues of racial justice. We know that there's initial flare up from social awareness and the display of civility and sympathy for oppressed groups. But we know that as these things develop, we see a drop off because people understand they have things to lose. We saw the same kind of support, I think, around Occupy a few years ago, where everyone in the academy especially were saying how much they supported it, how much we should actually be talking about predatory loans and neoliberalism and this logic of exploitation. And Angela Davis gets up at Times Square or whatnot and gives great speeches to inspire people. But ultimately, when they started putting poor homeless people next to middle-class white people, all notions of economic solidarity break down because we understand that there's a racial dynamic. This system, I think, is just as easy, that we know that lots of white people, even white liberal Americans, think that Black people, specifically Black men, are some of the most violent elements in society. The work of Philip Goff, for instance, suggests that white people don't feel a lot of sympathy for Black men, that there's a process of symbolization where they view them as animals, if not apes. So if we think about this in terms of the implicit biases that white America has, not only towards the individual bodies that are being killed, but also to the overall trajectory of Black Lives Matter, it seemed unlikely that this would lead to something actually transformative in American society. In various political sciences, I'm thinking about Corey McConaughey, for instance, have actually shown that white support for Black Lives Matter decreases by the extent they think that Black Lives Matter is actually trying to protect or associate itself with the plight of Black males. So that suggests a few things to us. First, that the kind of popular iterations that we're getting from Black Lives Matter that switches the focus from young Black men and boys, who are the majority of the people, 96% of the people being killed by cops, to Black women is a strategy for liberal recognition, corporate sponsorship, and those kinds of institutionalized forms of support that we see with reformist movements more generally. And the second part is that Black Lives Matter then has not fundamentally questioned why this lack of empathy and true revolutionary societal change that would eliminate some of the specific forms of racism that keeps enabling Black and brown men to be killed disproportionately in this country should not be addressed in the movement. So I think that on two levels is ineffective, right? We're not dealing with the real structural problem, and it's primarily reformists trying to deal with white people's feelings about racial change and the speed of racial transformation in this country. That being said, the drop-off is predictable as we're coming full circle to the election. The reality of the situation is that there's a need for political stability. The American public doesn't know its economic certainty. It doesn't know the racial certainty. It's not sure about the legitimacy of the government. And in those general trends, Americans tend to prefer security to liberty, right? That they want some kind of backing. They don't want to lose too much. So I think that that's what we're seeing. And I think that there's also a counter movement, if you will, a backlash to a lot of the arguments that BLM prided itself on. So now that you have this swell of the Proud Boys who are people of color pushing back against some of this language, you have the huge swell of conservatism, you have the classic white supremacists, and you have a swelling around the campaign for Trump. These elements act to counteract the kind of liberal reformism that BLM is pushing. So I don't think the future looks bright. I think that if Trump wins again, we're going to see almost absolute silence on this issue. in terms of a realizable reformist, program, I think you'll still get protests, but I think you're going to deal with a beefed up police force that's not interested in defunding. It's going to actually read many of the BLM people as Black identity extremists and actually dangerous to social order.
Well, that raises a real big question for me then for that I want to hear from both of you. Is racial justice something that's possible in the United States? So here's a background condition that you can sort of, or a consideration to think about. There are some folks like Derek Bell, Richard Delgado, critical race theorists, who warn us in thinking about social movements trying to accomplish racial justice that when we look at progress that has been made towards racial justice in the United States, these have only occurred under the conditions of interest convergence, namely that progress in racial justice is something that only occurs if white people also see a benefit in those changes for themselves, usually some kind of material benefit for themselves. So Derek Bell's written, of course, of how Brown v. Board of Education was not something that was done in order to just entirely improve the condition of Black folk in the United States, but really there was material benefit for the United States, for white people, and for the appearance of the United States on the international field during the Cold War. So my question is do you think that this kind of critical race theory, which has gotten a lot of attention recently and attacked by President Trump, do you think that this idea of interest convergence is a useful lens by which to analyze what's going on in the US today with race, namely that the horizon of possibility for racial justice is very slim unless it can somehow make white people believe that they're going to get something out of it too? Is that why BLM is slipping? Because white people don't see a benefit for themselves in the demands of disarming police and moving resources in other directions? Mendoza, what do you think?
Well, that's an interesting way of putting it. So there's justice with the big J justice, like making things just. And I mean, if you ask a philosopher, is it possible? I guess it is possible, right? But is it likely to happen? Probably not likely to happen. I think in order to get justice with a capital J, you need to take critical stock of the past, and we have a president and administration that is attacking the kinds of tools you need to have this kind of critical engagement with the past in critical race theory. And at the same time, he doesn't denounce groups like the Proud Boys, right? So you've got this dynamic where you not only don't want to deal with the past, you kind of want to cover it over. So that's what we need to do, is create an environment where educators are encouraged to teach this kind of history, this critical history, and not discouraged with the fear that like they might get fired or something. Interest convergence is interesting because if we now talk about justice with maybe a small j, or just make progress or try to ameliorate things, I don't know what I think of it as a tactic, and maybe that's part of what you're asking. I think that if you look at the success that criminal justice reform has had, whether it's done so knowingly, I actually don't know if a lot of these folks were reading Derek Bell, but what successes they've had is doing this sort of thing. They're not saying, hey, as Tommy said earlier, they're not saying, hey, look, this system is systematically eliminating, killing, brutalizing Black men. They say, look how expensive the prisons are. Look how dangerous the police are. What happened to Breonna Taylor is bad. Why? Well, because potentially any cop can come into your apartment and shoot you up. What happened to Tamir Rice is bad. Not qua Black boy, but qua that could be my 12-year-old with a gun or something, right? So there's the whatever successes the movement has had, I think, is when it's appealed to interest convergence. So I don't know if, so there's kind of two ways to think about it. One is that right? And I don't think it should be right. Justice shouldn't just be pragmatic. But if we want justice with a small j, make some reforms, make things better, make things safer for Black and brown folks, I don't know what I think of it as a strategy. I do find myself sometimes on the street sort of employing that, not necessarily in my work, but when it comes to things like immigration and ICE, I often say, well, look, you're afraid of a strong federal government, and here you are in this one particular important area, giving them all these sorts of powers. and you saw this in Portland too, right? A lot of those federal marshals were actually under the auspices of using the powers of ICE, where you can, within 100 miles of any border, pretty much ignore the Fourth Amendment. So there have been these sorts of appeals, and I think they've had, I don't know what material success they have had, but they've definitely had some sort of rhetorical or ideological success. But then I worry that maybe we're just fooling ourselves. Maybe we make these arguments and we ignore these other more justice arguments for the sake of, well, the lesser evil. We can make some things happen. And so I'm saying I'm kind of torn. I don't know materially how well using interest convergence as a tactic has been. I do think that using that as saying, well, that's justice, that's with a capital J, that's wrong. I'll let Professor Curry jump in on this.
Yeah, you know, I guess one of the cool things about actually living in Alabama was that Richard Delgado was my neighbor.
That's right. That's right.
So Richard and Gene have very strong opinions about using interest convergence as a tactic. And they think this is where kind of second generation race critics went wrong. You know, Derek is using it as a description of how civil rights law is being motivated. That what we think to be actual successes are at best symbolic, are perhaps Pyrrhic victories, to be honest, because they were always until something worse happening. And I think we see that clearly with Obama. One of the last letters that Derek ever sent me over email was him giving a speech about Obama, saying that, look, there's going to be something bad happen. We just don't know what it is yet, because this is too much of a symbolic victory for Black Americans. And of course, even though he's not here with us anymore, he was absolutely correct about that. The problem with interest convergence is that it's always reformist and it's always contingent. And what I mean by that is that it assumes that a system will adjust for the benefit of a minority group, but those gains, because they're merely reformist and based on what he called in his last book, in his book Silent Covenants, to be third-party interests, the first two parties of white people will always retract on that when it's not in their interest, right? So we end up with a situation where we think we've made gains, like in Obama and all the philosophers, if you remember correctly, at SAP, we're saying, oh, we've made this change. These white people are different. See, Tommy, you're wrong. I believe in hope. And then I was like, nah, just wait for it, right? And sure enough, we get a backlash. And now they can't explain the foundations of America because Black rights aren't permanent. They're not natural rights. They're not human rights. They're contingent rights that are gifted on a certain basis or a situational understanding that white people have of a given circumstance. The election of Obama could be explained this way, to be quite honest. You had a Republican government that used up the surplus, that absolutely destroyed the economy. So you had young white people that are coming out of college that had hopes and dreams of owning a house, having some kind of economic success, most of whom were women. So, Biden said that he had a binder full of women, right? Made that joke. Right? Obama saying that, good feminism is good economic policy. So it appealed to those voters, right? But a decade later, they have other interests. So I think that it shows that anything that we do in the United States is going to be based on white power structures. And that's why I don't think racial justice is ever a real possibility here. The reality of the situation, I think that we could talk about this even more in our professional lives, is that if you say things that white people are unhappy with, white people try to punish you for those things. And what we've seen with BLM is that they've taken a very moderate stance. They're not violent. They're not centering radical working class people or ideas. They're appealing to a certain kind of democratic platform around issues of gender and sexual orientation, not purely on the basis of race and racism, or even capitalism for that matter, right? They're not, they're not pushing Marxism. They're not pushing communism. They're not pushing Pan-Africanism. All the kind of ideas that have historically been constructed as threats by the US government are not being centered in that movement, despite many of the working class people who are protesters fundamentally believing in these kinds of ideas. So inevitably what we're stuck with is a cyclical notion of racial progress that never moves beyond the symbolic and fundamentally does not change the lifestyles and the economic position of Black people in the United States. And I think that the repetitive burden of that, the enduring burden of that, is that we're, even in our lifetimes, we're still having the same conversation that we heard when we were younger and that our foreparents were fighting about when we, before we hear. And at some point, Black people, brown folk, have to make some sort of realization that if this is going to be the circumstances by which we're actually engaging, that it's not going to be through reorientations of values. It's not going to be through, social mobility or uplift. There's either going to have to be a destruction of the system or us accepting our permanent subjugation under the system. History shows that people generally don't accept perpetual subjugation. So I think that at some point of our lifetime, we may have to get very honest about the possibility of some sort of civil or violent conflict within the United States, given these conditions.
Well, this is something I think that Derek Bell has sort of suggested, right? Is that racial justice, if we're going to talk about with capital J, is something that can really only happen with radical social transformation of the major institutions of the United States. And quite frankly, he thought that, most white people were not really up to that because the institutions are set up to benefit them. So what would be their interest in changing this? That racial idealism and good feelings for working for your fellow man, those are very sort of thin motivators, right? So in some sense, he agreed with your assessments here. Jose, I have a question that comes from your work and sort of talking about possibilities of achieving racial justice and perhaps possible obstacles. I know that in your work, you've argued that Latinx people, the history of Latinx communities in the United States have a certain kind of historical tendency to seek assimilation into white identity, right? For many Latinx people, and particularly I know this in the history of Mexican and Mexican-American people in the United States, there's been a tendency to distance themselves from Black and indigenous communities and to try to seek white identity and the privileges that might bring them within the United States. Can you talk a little bit about this tendency for us a little bit better? And thinking about that tendency, do you think that there are resources within Latinx communities today for achieving racial justice that can overcome this historical tendency that we've had in our communities of wanting to appear white and not to be associated with Black and indigenous folk?
So yeah, I think that if we're gonna somehow in some way, shape, or form overcome racism, it's going to have to start with communities like the Latinx community, because it's kind of has a unique sort of positionality in the United States. I sort of begin with Eduardo Bonilla Silva's Latin Americanization thesis, and the idea that race and whiteness in the United States is changing, and that seems true to, if you go back to the 1850s, what it meant to be white in the 1850s is not the same as what it is to be white in the 1950s, right? There was a dangerous religion with conspiracies of taking over the governments in 1850 called Catholicism. And then these folks weren't white and the Irish weren't white, not fully white anyway. And then by the 1950s, they were very much into white. So whiteness and white supremacy have this tendency of not just committing genocide and eliminating non-whites, not just segregating and separating non-whites, but when it's really sees, at least in the United States, so places like South Africa, this might be different, but places where whites are the majority, it also kind of expands itself. And so I think part of what the underside of the Latin Americanization, so the one side of the Latin Americanization thesis that Bonilla Silva focused on or tries to say is like, well, why is it Latinx folks are going to continue to be sort of non-white? And he's right to some degree. But what I think we fail to realize is if you go to Latin America, there's a lot of white folks in Latin America. They come to the US, they're not white folks, but they're white folks in Latin America. They grow up with white privilege, they understand whiteness, they come to the United States and they think, well, similar system, it should work for me. So part of it is seeking it out, but part of it is also, I think, a reaction to whiteness expanding in order to deal with demographic changes that we're seeing in 2050, where, if whiteness was the same in 1950 as it's going to be in 2050, then whites would be no longer a majority. But if we continue the story that whiteness can expand and include some non-white folks, then by 2050 it doesn't have to be a minority. And so part of what I argue, and I think it's important for the Latinx community to understand, is that not everyone in the Latinx community is at the bottom of the well. And it's kind of hard, because you go out into the world, you're a brown person, and you do experience discrimination and so forth. But there are some Latinx folks who, whether they seek it out or not, don't seek it out, can almost function as white folks. And so then they say, well, look, here's my experience. I don't know why people like, you know, Professor Curry are complaining, like I'm non-white and I don't experience these sorts of things. Well, because you're functionally white. And so I think we're going to see this changing. And what I worry about are those kind of simple equivocations. We have things to worry about within our own community. I think, for example, like the Spanish language, yes, it's under attack. And when people say, you know, English only, it's clearly racist and white supremacist. But what's interesting about the Spanish language is it is a European language. You go to places like in Latin America, places like Mexico have, you know, there's, I think, maybe 20 languages. There were over 100,000 people, 20 Native American indigenous languages that over 100,000 people speak. And yet that's, you know, ignored. You can still learn, you can learn Spanish probably in any high school here in the United States, even though it is under attack. You can still go and take a course in Spanish. I don't think it's very easy to take a course in an indigenous language in the United States, right? So there's a sense that there is a way that certain, not all, but certain Latinx folks can be brought into whiteness. Even the language can be, because it is a European language, can be brought into whiteness. So we're set up. We're not, it's not that we're necessarily all white now, but we're set up to basically what I call Space Traders 2.0, which is that, you know, for some Latinx folks, they're going to be offered a deal. And we might be in solidarity with, we might be Latinx for Black Lives now, but I wonder what's going to happen when this deal sort of comes up. Are we going to sell out the Black and indigenous and also Asian folks? People forget there's a lot of Asian Latinx folks as well. So I'm hoping that we can both form solidarity, but it's going to be an interesting kind of solidarity because it's going to require that some Latinx folks see their whiteness, which is, it's tough. It's kind of contradictory. You want to have privilege and so on and so forth, but you also, there's a sense where like in recognizing that some people feel like, well, I might be selling out or something. A place like Albuquerque, your hometown, is kind of interesting. They were taking down the statue of, was it Juan de Onate? Right, so as they're taking down these Confederate statues, they're also taking down a statue of what is a Hispanic guy in the American Southwest, but that's because the guy was brutal to indigenous folks, enslaved indigenous folks. For all intents and purposes, he was a white dude. So
yeah,
anyway.
I mean, I think it's really interesting that, you know, what you've talked about is that, you know, you could look at the history, for instance, of Mexican American social movements in the United States, particularly in the early part of the 20th century, like the movement of LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens. In the 20s and 30s, they were lobbying real hard for the federal government to consider Mexicans as white people and not as colored. And there are lots of different arguments amongst, particularly in the Texas chapters of LULAC, as to why Mexicans should be considered different than both Black and indigenous communities. And one of them was about these ideas of the Spanish language. We're actually Europeans. We're just your sort of browner brothers, white folk. And so we're not really that much different than you. At least we're not Black. Right. And so there were these arguments have been made historically. And I think that what you're seeing now in places like Albuquerque and in particularly in California around the missions and the controversy of Junipero Serra and stuff like that is a question about what is the solidarity of Latinx folk. And I think, as you pointed out, there's a lot of different demographic groups within the Latinx community, including Afro Latinx folk. So, you know, when we talk about Latinx solidarity and possibilities of justice, what does that mean for Black folk who have Latinx heritage as well? And in some ways, there's some dangers because historically there has been a tendency of some people who have more white privilege to sell out, right? Folks who are indigenous or Black within our community. So we don't have to wait necessarily for Space Traders 2.0, right? We've seen this go on quite extensively in the 20th century here. And so this seems to be a real big problem. Tommy, I wanted to talk a little bit about your work and see how you can think about this idea of racial solidarity. In the last few years, you've been working to build an entirely new academic discipline called Black Male Studies. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about why you think there is a need for this new academic area. What obstacles did you think were existing in academia as you saw it that needed this new area of study going on? And what do you hope that Black male studies can do to contribute towards racial justice, particularly in the US?
Well, I think there's a few things. Looking at the dynamics in our field, I think that when we speak about Black and brown men, the conversation is usually negative, right? I think that we've all sat in on sessions and panels where they describe the machismo of Latinx or Latino men as patriarchal, dangerous, abusive, rapist, and the same thing for Black men. And I guess I became tired of hearing that conceptualization so readily accepted, despite practically no evidence that justified it. And over time, it became, and particularly at conferences or organizations like SAP or the APA, I think that the whiteness becomes burdensome because what you have are Black and brown scholars presenting this information to white audiences without context and off of an identity politic that in many ways serves to justify the negative ideas and stereotypes white people already have of the men of those respective groups. And it becomes so solidified that no one can question it. So the idea is that if someone says that Black men are angry or they're rapists or that they're aggressive, if I stand up or raise my hand and say, well, that's not true, then somehow I shouldn't be able to have the floor to speak, even though it's said about my group. And throughout this kind of discourse for over a decade, I found that once you start interrogating it, there's very, very little evidence to support it. So usually people who are making arguments about Black male deviance and Black male violence are relying on bell hooks. They're not relying on epidemiology or chronological studies. People who say that Black men have privilege are relying on an analytic argument by people like Kimberly Crenshaw. They're not actually looking at the circumstance of Black and brown men in the United States and the tremendous downward mobility that they have throughout the US economy. And I think what really kind of cut the straw, or the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak, was this intolerance to actual facts. Black and brown men are two of the most underrepresented groups in the US Academy. But throughout various sectors, even our own field of philosophy, people act like somehow we're the majority, right? That somehow there's all of these Black and brown men running through the university, controlling everything and pulling all the levers that's keeping, women and other groups down. And what I found disconcerting about that is not simply the polemical argument, but that it takes away a certain kind of humanity. So we don't get to explore the history of vulnerability that Black men in particular have, for instance, to sexual violence, to rape, to cannibalism, the experiences of depression, their experiences of early childhood sexual abuse, their experience of spousal abuse and intimate partner abuse. These are all topics that we've seen at numerous conferences where people fundamentally exclude the voices of Black and brown men, even though they're disproportionately affected by these kinds of ills and kinds of violence. And I remember specifically a few years ago when the APA did a Me Too session, and they posted a picture, and it was all white women, right, in the picture with a few women of color. And I thought to myself, well, isn't that interesting, given that the group in the United States that reports the highest level of sexual victimization within a given year are actually Black men. And it's this intolerance that we have to the lived realities of racialized men that made me really concentrate on trying to develop a field in a particular way of studying Black and brown men and Indigenous men and Jewish men based on facts. And I think the importance about this can't be undersold. Imagine for a moment where we create a whole discourse in the US Academy suggesting that certain groups of men who are Black or brown want power, aim to dominate, and want to ultimately harm people to gain their manhood. And that's a tentative thesis, right? There have been no mass genocides by these groups of men anywhere in the 20th or 21st century. But that's a thesis that's being proposed. Now, on the other hand, think of this. There's been whole movements of white women from the 1860s well into the 1970s and 80s that have systematically criminalized, participated in imperialism, participated in genocides, participated in spousal child abuse and other horrors of Jim Crowism and slavery, have raped young Black men and boys, and they have zero accountability or visibility as the people who commit those kinds of violence in our intellectual repertoire. So I had to ask myself, One, you have a history, a lineage of white women acting as oppressors alongside white men, committing the same kind of violence, the same kind of sexual atrocities. And you can't even speak or utter this as an academic field of study. On the other hand, you have Black and brown men who are feared to be savages, who are feared to be violent, that we seem to have to reify in every kind of discursive formation or order of knowledge that we have in any discipline, and you can't challenge it. So I said, well, then what? There's a fundamental incompatibility with these two ideas. That I'm supposed to accept that people that look like me are fundamentally violent, but I have to disown that people who have historically been violent to my group are not violent. And what Black male studies tries to do is reconcile these tensions with facts. There's a history of sexual vulnerability, of genocide, of disproportionate criminalization, of underrepresentation that Black and brown men have to their female counterpart. And that certainly doesn't say anything about the kind of violence that our sisters have to go through. But it does say that in a world where these groups of men have to suffer from these histories of atrocities, these kinds of vulnerabilities, and this underrepresentation in our present day, that there is more to be said about those groups of men than simply they want to be patriarchs or they're, they exhibit too much machismo. And it's this pathological orientation that the academy, that various disciplines in the United States have towards racialized men that Black male studies tries to interrupt. And ultimately that's based on a very simple idea, that the kinds of progress and the kinds of empathy that we see around race and racism exclude racialized men. That white people feel sympathy towards women and other groups, but not racialized men. And part of the reason for this is because of the psychological triggers involved with the fear that they have of these groups of people. So when we see BLM focusing on Black women or other Black groups, we understand that because there's a transubstantiation of being, that there's a very real understanding in society that young Black and brown men are not the lives that white Americans are going to empathize with. So you have to replace them to make movements successful. Black male studies is the only discipline that's trying to analyze that facet of life. It's trying to analyze the kinds of dehumanization that racialized men suffer and to ask more philosophical and sociological questions about why these things endure, why they're rationalized discursively, and why they become part of disciplinary formations, such that we read gender as if Black and brown men don't have a history of sexual misandric violence against them. They're just always tried to be white. It was trying to disrupt patterns of dehumanization and actually give racialized men from across the board a different kind of platform upon which they can actually discuss and theorize themselves anew.
So if I understand both of you in the work that you're doing and have done, part of what we might talk about in terms of obstacles to achieving racial justice with the big J is, one, a tendency of certain sectors within the brown Latinx community to seek whiteness and to try to sell out for material benefit or privilege other members of the community. So there's a kind of splintering or fragmentation possible within Latinx communities that has historically been a problem and might continue to be a problem. And then we also see an unwillingness of the academy to be able to address the kinds of harms and violence that a racist system creates, particularly for Black and brown males, is that there's an unwillingness to really plumb the depths of how much this system harms certain groups of human beings. Is this correct in terms of the analysis that you are providing here, both of you? Is that these are significant obstacles if we want to try to achieve any kind of racial justice in the United States, that these are things we need to overcome?
I would say so. The difference is that many times white liberals and white people in America generally define racist stereotypes of groups based on their perceptions of racialized men. This has been a long-standing finding across social psychology and sociology for the last 20 years or so. So think about what that means. That means that if you can distance yourself from Latino or Black or Indigenous men and let in other groups or form relationships with other groups, you get to dismiss racism. But the stereotypes you have about Black people being violent or Black people being promiscuous or dangerous are not based on your fears of Black women. They're based on your fears of Black men. And in the academic system that we live in, as well as the social system that we live in, we see different types of groups and different individuals able to elevate in that system as evidence that racism has fallen away, when the racist stereotypes and the groups that are targeted by those stereotypes remain unchanged or unaffected by the mobility of certain privileged, educated elites or capitalists. And the major problem we're dealing with is that we don't want to confront reality, right? I mean, think about it. 96% of the Black people killed by cops are Black men and boys, period. It's just a fact for the last 5 years or so. And we're not having conversation. There's not been one philosophy conference. There's not been one social movement. There's not been one special specifically dedicated to how we stop that problem. Because the way that we want to conceptualize it has to be in line with these other larger democratic platforms, right? We're measuring whether or not certain groups have liberatory visions. I mean, imagine this. We're saying that certain groups have a better handle on solving racism, not because they're actually decreasing racism, but because they're more in line with the Democratic National Platform, right? Like that's becoming our metric. So we see all kinds of celebration around these people are going to vote Democratic. These people are against Trump. And nobody's shown us how this is going to fundamentally benefit Black and brown communities. Nobody's shown us how this is going to eliminate poverty. Nobody's shown us how this is going to stop police killing, and they certainly haven't shown how it's going to decrease the prison industrial complex and police state. So if we know that those are the fundamental obstacles in a very real sense of us having justice in the United States, and no one seems to be able to deliver on that, then why are we disowning the people in movements who are most affected by it, which are young Black and brown men?
Well said. Do you want to comment about these obstacles of the Latinx community in terms of achieving racial justice?
I mean, I'm just going to piggyback on what Professor Curry was saying, because I agree with it. I think if you look at our discipline in philosophy, one of the things and it could be wrong. I'm doing the thing the Professor Curry correctly tells us not to do. But so I'm just, I don't quite have the facts. But I think I'm correct in saying and you can correct me if I'm wrong too, Professor Roscoe. Well, I remember starting in philosophy, whatever it was 15 years ago, and there weren't very many Latinx folks or Latinos. And I feel like there's been kind of a mushrooming of Latinx folks in the discipline. You could have said the same thing about Black men. And I think if there's one demographic in our discipline, philosophy, that has not increased, it's been Black men. Departments do not hire Black men. They're willing to hire someone like me to get their sort of diversity cred, but they won't hire a Black man. And and I don't have a better reason than racism, because I'm looking at the quality of Black men with PhDs coming out of institutions like Texas A&M, who find it impossible to get jobs, and they're quality folks. And so in some sense, we, the American Philosophy Association, pat ourselves on the back, because in some ways we're getting more diverse, and that seems to be true. But in some way, the story remains the same. The same people who are at the bottom of the well remain at the bottom of the well. And I could be wrong about this, but maybe someone's going to show me some numbers and say you're totally wrong, because I don't know the numbers. But my experience has been that there's not been much of an increase, if at all, of Black men in tenure track philosophy positions, while all these other groups, not just Latinx, but all these other groups, we've seen diversity in all these other groups, except when it comes to Black men in philosophy. But I could be wrong. I don't know what you folks have to say about that.
Well, if I may, I think this is the problem when you don't have good demography in philosophy, is that they want to count raw numbers. And the reality of the situation is that most of the Black men, they estimate between 75 or 80, are much older. So most of the Black men that are in senior positions are in their 60s. And I can think off the top of my head around between 10, maybe 12 that are that age. That means within the next decade or so, these people will either retire or unfortunately pass on. That dramatically changes the population, because we're talking about 100 to 120 people, and I think the real difference in philosophy with Black men is they lack social mobility. So you don't see Black men getting hired at one institution, then able to move around based on their research, et cetera. Usually what you find are Black men who get one job and have to stay in that one job a disproportionately long amount of time compared to other groups. But philosophy is somewhat different in that situation, because overall, Black and brown men, well, Black men specifically, have almost 30,000 professors less than their female counterparts. So the real issue is that why does philosophy seem to privilege or increasingly privilege or allow white men and white women to be hired in jobs as if those are marks of diversity. But we don't see the same kind of hiring for Black and brown people. And they act like it's a trade-off when Black and brown people want to be hired. They have no problem marking out jobs that they know that are going to go to a white person, or if they advertise a feminism, go to a white woman. And I think it's these kind of imaginary politics. You know, we've been in the sessions together, right? Where we're complaining about racism and the few liberal white people come there, but we already know how the system works. So we always want to talk about social justice. We always want to talk about racism, but the way that you do that is you basically hire one person that's not white, be they brown or Black, you put them in a department, they catch pure hell by the white people who are insensitive and marginalizing them, they get upset, and then people will say bad things about them at the end of the day. And we see this play out over and over again over people's careers. That's not disciplinary change, but the same kind of thing happens in society, where working class people, Black people who have radical ideas, working class Black men are not the people that are put in front of the cameras to lead movements or organizations. The people that we have leading these movements are extremely liberal, they're extremely reformist, and they're extremely economically well off. So that means that they're not having a fundamental connection to the experience that many oppressed people have. And that same kind of class dynamic replicates itself in philosophy. They're not trying to hear from first generation Black or brown people. They don't care about that. They don't want to hear from Black scholars that have their own mind. They don't want to hear from brown scholars that are not going to speak a language they understand. In fact, they insist that everything's in English, right? And this is not an open discipline. It's not an open way to think about these kinds of problems. But we tolerate it because we know that sometimes that's the only game in town. And I think that it's under this kind of constraint, right, that we keep seeing philosophy choose people that are going to replicate its ideas rather than fundamentally challenge it. And that's why we haven't seen this huge increase or influx of Black students or brown students generally, but we certainly haven't seen the mobility of Black men throughout the discipline.
Well, both of you have raised questions about the discipline of philosophy in particular, and both of you have, you know, all of us have our training in philosophy primarily. And so I have a question about this. Given these kinds of issues that you're talking about within the field, and they might be broader to other academic disciplines as well, but particularly for philosophy, is philosophy a place that can contribute to liberatory scholarship towards racial justice? Is this a field that is going to help us think better about liberation for, amongst others, Black and brown people? Or is it so constructed now that you would recommend young scholars to go elsewhere?
Oh, can I please say that, Mendoza?
Yeah, go.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Philosophy is not going to contribute to any significant formulation of liberation for Black and brown folk. And if I'm being honest, and I will say this because, you know, I can, I think many of the white people in philosophy actually absolutely detest Black people, and they certainly are not fond of brown people either. Because in 10 years, we've seen no real change. We've seen thousands of white women get jobs in philosophy in a discipline full of white people under the rubric of diversity. And I have not seen Black or brown people hired, recruited, or supported to the same extent that these other white minorities are. We were more happy to talk about the celebration of different white sexual orientations, be it female, trans, or feminist, or queer, in departments than they are to actually have Black or brown folks in those departments bring different cultural experiences and different sets of expertise in their institutions. At the same time that they tout that they're diverse, that they care about BLM, that they care about issues of immigration, that they are not racist. So philosophy constantly gaslights minorities by pretending that if they go through their programs, if they give them money, if they play politics, if they serve their institutions, if they go to conferences, support their organizations, that at the end of the road, there's going to be jobs and employment. And that promise is not carried out for a large majority of people who are stuck in teaching institutions, despite having records that far surpass their white counterparts at Research One institutions across the country. So this is not a field that Black or brown folks should go into. It's not a field that allows them to express themselves both culturally and intellectually. And it's a disservice for us to keep emphasizing the idea that because we participate in white conferences and white social benefits, that these people are somehow becoming less racist just because we're at their conference. It's the most ridiculous thing that I've ever heard, because you constantly have white people maintaining the structures and governing positions, not only as institutions, but of hiring committees throughout the country.
What do you think, Mendoza?
I don't know how you follow that up. It's hard to disagree with it. Um, I think I'm gonna speak on like two other issues that are sort of related of what you can do with philosophy. I think there are folks who think that if they just and maybe they've got to know at some level that this isn't right, but maybe the feeling is that if they just wrote the right article, that this would change the world. There's the Marx's saying, his 11th thesis on Feuerbach, that philosophers have merely interpreted the world. The point is to change it. And I think people read that or hear that and they think, well, then that means philosophy needs to be more active. And I actually think it was just a criticism of almost a criticism of the discipline itself. This is what philosophers do. If you want to change the world, this might not be the place to go into. I wish philosophers would live up to their ideals. So you got these ideals of justice and equality, go on the streets and do it as an activist. That'd be great. I worry sometimes that philosophers will sort of poach some of these ideas of activists and try to present them as philosophy and kind of defang these ideas. So I do worry about that. I think philosophers should be more activists, but not for the sake of necessarily doing better philosophy. I know that's kind of counter to what a lot of people think, but I do worry about this sort of a philosopher in the ivory tower coming down to the movement and saying, well, now I'm going to tell you what to do, or taking ideas from these folks and trying to present them as though these are my ideas. I kind of came up with them. So I worry because I don't know that, I think as human beings, people who do philosophy can be very good activists. I worry about philosophers being activists because I don't know how much good we can actually do. It's very Hegelian in some ways. I think sometimes philosophy is that, like Hegel said, the owl at dusk, right? So maybe we come at the end, but John Rawls' Theory of Justice is probably the most famous book in political philosophy right now, and I don't know that it did much to change the world. I think when philosophers do make a change, they've got a different hat on. It's not the philosophy hat. And this isn't totally to say that you should be completely divorced from reality when you do your philosophy. You shouldn't, but you should be careful, if that made sense.
Well, let me ask this question, right? So, right, you bring up the point that, right, for the last almost 50 years, one of the most significant paradigms for thinking about justice in a liberal democratic society like ours, John Rawls, it's hard to sort of see how it's made a deep impact in social movements or in social policy reform and change, but it's something that almost all folk who work in political philosophy in the United States have to have as a touchstone. You have to begin talking about Rawls and criticizing Rawls at some point in order to get started. And as Tommy's pointing out, the ways in which people are, the political economy, the economy is not one that's rewarding Black and brown scholars in any kind of sense. And so we have this kind of sense that the work, the foundational work, isn't speaking to live justice issues. The political economy of the academy isn't rewarding people to go into philosophy with different cultural backgrounds. So my question, I guess, is something like this. Is there something for Black and Latinx scholars to do together to further a project of racial justice? Where is that work, do you believe, possible? If it is possible, what kinds of solidarity is it possible between Black and brown scholars to sort of see through some of these mystifications that you've been talking about today, to help us articulate a better liberatory message? What can be done and where can it be done and by whom?
I didn't know if that was for Mendoza or me. So yes, I do think there are issues of solidarity. I think that anti-colonial frameworks have historically been bridges across these kinds of issues. But again, with the civil rights movement, with the parsing out of hierarchies within white society, resources get distributed different ways, right? Because the Latino community is able to assimilate at a different pace than Black Americans have been. You get these tensions, right? Because Black Americans are very suspicious and sensitive to this kind of assimilatory effect that many Latino and Latinx people have in the United States. But on the other hand, as we know, it's not like brown communities throughout the world are doing great. So there is a basis of political solidarity at the very least. But given the work that I do, right, the overlapping intellectual history, the different movements and revolts that happen all through South America and the global South, I think these relationships are much, much closer, right? You know, people in Africa were dropped off in South America. We have a very real genealogical, if not biological, connection over the centuries. The difference is that because of the geopolitical circumstances and power of the nation state, we see ourselves as fundamentally different in this regard. I think that that's a mistake. I think looking at America as a colony, or at least a semi-colony, is the best way to understand the different trajectories and hierarchies that have emerged between different groups of people, specifically Black and brown people. And I think that any real analysis of neoliberalism, meaning the ways that economic systems have contingently rewarded certain classes of Black people and brown folk to rule over other classes of Black and brown folk in white institutions, gives us lots of evidence to suggest that we're going through the very same kind of problem. If we don't correct course, if we don't, and what I mean by that is if we don't have intellectuals that are interested in these concrete problems and theorizing these things together, I fear that people throughout the working class and even the activist class will not have anything but identity politics and intersectionality to base their arguments and their activism on. The same way in the 1960s and 70s, the same way in the 1980s, that we had intellectuals who organically involved themselves with problems in the society and of the economy and within neighborhoods, is the same task I think Black and brown scholars have to entertain themselves with today. Pragmatism is not going to stop white people from killing us, right? That's not a poke. That's the reality. SAP is absolutely useless in this regard. The APA is absolutely useless in this regard. They don't care about the lives of Black and brown people in a way that seriously motivates scholarship that's speaking to and trying to empower these communities. So the responsibility of the Black and brown philosopher in this sense is to reclaim that kind of duty and that kind of real philosophical sociology, to start dealing with how problems can be theoretically conceptualized to motivate people in the real world. White philosophers reflect the world. I think Black and brown philosophers have an obligation to try to transform the world. But again, that puts us at odds with the kind of disciplinary training and established orders of knowledge that we're also trying to elevate it, right? And I think that that's kind of one of the things that makes my career so tragically entertaining is that I never bought into any of these ideas. And there was a steep price to pay for it. I just happened to end up on the better end because I was comfortable moving outside the United States. But I think we have to be very honest that the solidarity that we're talking about, the solidarity that Black and brown intellectuals have in philosophy and throughout the academy, will be institutionally unpopular. But that is often the cost when we're trying to make serious change, if not at the very least serious commentary about the state of our oppression and the role that universities, the police state, and the society more generally play in sustaining that racial order.
Well, you're being somewhat modest in this, in terms of how this has affected you, right? In order to do that kind of work in philosophy, you were essentially driven out of the country by death threats. So the price that you're paying is not just simply, well, I didn't get tenure or I didn't get the promotion, but your family was literally put in harm's way, and you had to leave the country in order to be able to continue to do this kind of work.
Yeah, and I would say that I think the greatest irony of that is that, since I was a full professor at A&M, that's why I say it's kind of tragically humorous, because, I checked every box, so to speak, right? That, I had the scholarship, I had the awards, et cetera. But even in the 21st century, you're confronted with a situation where if you say that Black people have a right to defend themselves from white supremacists, that becomes, hate speech. You get to become constructed as an enemy of white people, an enemy of the state. And the unfortunate situation is I could have stayed at Texas A&M for the rest of my life, but who would have wanted to do that, right? And Europe became a much freer place to think about the types of issues that I was trying to think about and trying to actually develop as a philosopher. But I think that that's also a commentary of the kinds of dangers that Black and brown philosophers have in the United States. Like, that could have been any one of us, given what we write about. Right? It could have been any one of us. I just happened to have tenure and was able to, find other employment and had a few other offers if I decided to stay in the United States that year. But the reality of the situation is my wife and I had to be very honest. If we accept one of the jobs in the United States, this could happen again, right? And it would happen over and over again, because if you say that Black or brown folk have actual rights that can be used to defend themselves against white people, under a Trump administration, this is considered hate speech, right? Anything that defends you from white violence is anti-white. So it's the idea that whites have an unfettered license to kill and impose themselves on you. And as a racial minority, you have to accept that. And again, this is what I'm saying. The background of what we're discussing is not simply that you'll be unpopular, but that anything that steps outside of the white comfort zone or their imagination becomes met with violence to keep you in order. And as we know, we've seen this in our own discipline, where we've applied for jobs and we know we've been qualified, more qualified than the white people that end up getting it at the end. There's nothing that we can do about it. It doesn't matter how many books we publish. It doesn't matter how well regarded we are in the field. We cannot sway people to buy into our ideas despite the amount of work we do. It's too foreign for them. It's too radical for them. And that's the limitation of philosophy, that we have to constrain ourselves, that we have to shrink ourselves, our voices, our research interests, and the way we articulate them so that white people are not uncomfortable so that we can gain employment. And that's a tool of disciplinary power.
Mendoza, what do you see are the possibilities in philosophy for liberatory change, if any at all? Or do you agree with Tommy here that this is dangerous terrain for Black and brown people to start articulating liberatory horizons in philosophy?
I mean, given the world we live in, I think Tommy's absolutely correct. I would love to live in a world where all I taught were logic and metaphysics. Like I came into philosophy for a particular reason. I like this sort of stuff, but I find that I have to teach these other topics because no one else is going to teach them or teach them in the right way. When it comes to liberation, and I could be wrong about this, but from my own experience, the department that I thought armed me with the kinds of weapons I needed to make real change in the world was the ethnic studies department, especially the ethnic studies department at San Francisco State. It was very interdisciplinary. It gave me stuff that I needed from history, from economics. And as Professor Curry was pointing out, you couldn't just be sort of just a philosopher. You had to be able to dialogue in these different disciplines. And they armed me with things. And I knew different economic theories. I knew history. I knew sociology. I knew political science. And it was presented, packaged in a way to make the world a less racist place. So I'm not surprised that these are the departments that are under attack, right? And they're trying to eliminate them. And I think maybe there was, and I don't know this, but I assume there was maybe this hopefulness in the 70s of like, hey, we're getting more and more ethnic studies departments, right? So things are going to get better. But this goes back to what we talked about with Bell, right? We get these, these departments flourish, and now they're under attack, and I don't know if they're gonna come back. You need something. I think the academy needs to have something like that. And it's weird to see the academy come under attack the way it does, because we're in the academy, we know what it's like, and yet it's reflected to us in a very different way in Fox News. It's presented as though this crazy ultra left paradise where they just brainwash everyone to be a super lefty crazy activist that's going to create a new CHOP somewhere in their cities. And I think, well, it's not the experience I have. It's actually in some ways very conservative. And you have to kind of silo yourself into your, there's a lot of talk of interdisciplinarity, but I actually find that the people who get rewarded the most are the ones who kind of silo themselves in their particular discipline. So anyway, I'm not saying anything more than what Professor Curry has said, and I hate to end on such a pessimistic note, but for any aspiring philosopher who wants to make real change and make this place a less racist world, you can't just do philosophy. Unfortunately, you can't just, there's no logic problem that's going to solve this.
And considering the sorts of political environment that we're in currently, this seems to be doubly hard. I just read, for instance, that in Iowa, I think the University of Iowa has suspended all of its diversity trainings throughout the institution because they want to make sure that they are in line with President Trump's executive order, halting any kinds of sensitivity trainings, quote unquote, that might stereotype people or give people a sense that there's something particularly inherently racist with the United States. And so at least one major state institution has suspended all different kinds of workshops throughout the institution until it figures out whether they are teaching the right stuff in line with this this executive order. And I know that I've heard different universities around the country where their provosts are looking into whether or not the executive order against critical race theory somehow affects the teaching of ethnic studies in their institutions. And so Professor,
I might be teaching logic all the time now, rather sooner rather than later, right?
Well, this is what Dr. Curry was pointing out, is that if there's another Trump administration, what does this say for the possibility of doing the kind of liberatory work that you both have been talking about and have been trying to get at? It seems like the aperture for this kind of thing might be decreasing even more.
Yeah, I mean, look, this is my frustration, right? This is my frustration because philosophers are so ahistorical that they act like they can't imagine a moment that's already happened several times throughout history. Right? Under Trump, he's now attacking ideas. One of my responses to being attacked by the alt-right in 2017, in interviews, I would constantly say that, look, one of the alt-right's not stupid in the sense that they're coming to college campuses. They're trying to make their ideas a moderate platform within American higher education, which makes perfect sense given that paleo-conservatives have said over and over again that part of the reason they're losing on the social sphere is because they haven't been in the academy. They haven't been in universities so they can actually spread this ideology to students the way that leftists have. So it's not surprising that if you go to college, you become more liberal, at least in name and in identification with some political goals, because all your teachers are liberals. So now you have paleo conservatives coming out with the alt-right ideology that's making racism a moderate platform, the idea that white people need to survive, that they can reclaim America. This is infiltrating how we look at intellectual traditions within disciplines. It's actually pulling white people who were liberal by guilt over to the moderate, if not the right side, because they don't have to apologize. There's no incentive now for them being good white liberals. So now that Trump is giving this kind of executive order, and the last iteration of it said that federal money wouldn't be distributed to institutions that teach these types of things, it puts higher education at risk. So think about that seriously. What does it mean to have a whole bunch of people, black and brown folk, trained in a certain area with a certain expertise that's now being made unemployable by the larger institutions because these white people are not going to lose federal dollars just to make a few black people happy? This is space traders, right, in the university, right? And we don't want to be serious about this moment. No philosophy conference is having a conversation about this moment. And for us to get that, notice for all the white allies that we have, I have not seen one call for papers, one posting, one special session by the APA asking people to seriously reflect on what this means for the future of Africana, Latin American, decolonial, or any other kinds of philosophy that depends on these foundational theories as the basis of doing their current projects. So we exist in an environment where we're constantly told, hey, don't be the angry black guy. If you just line up and talk to white people, bring them along, Curry. Let them see things from your point of view. Like white people suddenly can't read books. You can just read Du Bois and figure this out, but you need a black person to hold your hand through it. Now you have white people saying, well, we don't even have an economic incentive to do that. They have no incentives to keep hiring black and brown people in a world where black and brown people together probably make up less than 200 people in a discipline of almost 20,000 people. Like think about what that means in that situation. We have conversations about diversity where black and brown folk make up probably 1% to 2% of the discipline. And at the same time, we refuse any kind of affirmative action to aggressively recruit, hire, and cultivate the talent of the people from these groups. We complain about diversity all day. Or we're mad because white women are 5,000 to 6,000 people of the 20,000 in the academy. We're mad because they're a third. God forbid that white women are a third when they're half of the university, right? But the black and brown people, we don't have to recruit more because we expect them to be minorities. We expect them to not be represented. So we're having conversation where there's going to be the probable demise, or certainly the rolling back of areas of study that disproportionately affect Black and brown people. And what we're talking about in terms of diversity is making sure that we keep white minorities visible, right? The system's rigged. There's not a single department in the United States that makes the recruitment of Black and brown faculty their priority. There's not a single department in the whole country where the majority of philosophy faculty are Black or brown people. But we have no problem with the majority of them being white people. Not a single problem with that. And that's what I mean. It's institutionally set up so that the kinds of thought, the kind of solidarity that we're talking about, the kinds of polemics that we're raising today about the discipline of society in general cannot become the norm within that department. That department would never get resources. And now, given what Trump's doing, that department would be on the chopping block, right? So you have a culture, an economic system, and an institutional practice that mandates the ostracization of Black and brown folk. And that's what philosophy needs to be talking about. Why is it that we have to reiterate the ideologies or the thinkers that white people give us that we already know have tyrannical histories and committed genocide, if not less horrendous acts of murder and violence against our own people? They have no problem insisting that we do this. But the minute we ask them to read a different book or consider a different thought, we get told that's not philosophy, right? This is about an asymmetrical power structure. This is about the behaviors and the institutionalization of racist practices in conferences and in the culture of philosophy more generally. Until we deal with that reality and how white supremacists like Trump actually end up supporting the same kind of liberal propaganda and practices of white liberal philosophers in the discipline, then we're not having a real conversation about the dynamics of racism in the country or in the US academies at large.
So I know Cornel West often makes this distinction. He says there's a difference between optimism and hope. Optimism being this kind of belief that things are just going to get better. They have to, they always do. And hope, which is a kind of an aspiration that says, I don't see any evidence that things are getting better, but I'm going to hold out the possibility for something just over the mountaintop. So thinking about that, I get the sense that both of you are saying neither of you are optimistic. Are you hopeful? Mendoza, what do you think?
Yeah, I have to be hopeful, or if not, why keep going? Why keep doing this stuff? Might as well start, just teaching logic right now. And I've got something for you if you look right over here, by the way. Give you a little hope right there. That's for you, Orozco.
Thank you. I appreciate that. You warm our science fiction heart, man.
But I guess I agree with the distinction, and I don't want to quibble over terms, but the way you've put it, I think I have to be hopeful in that sense.
Why exactly? Just because it gives you a sense that there's work to be done, and we have to do the work. Otherwise,
not just that, but also the fact that you do this work, you want to have some meaning. You write these papers, you go on these podcasts. I have conversations with really smart people, Professor Curry, and I got to think that like what he does, what I'm doing, is could have an impact, could be meaningful. We're not just playing Dungeons and Dragons or something, right? It's real. It's high stakes and it's matters. And we're down 30 points. The basketball season still go. We're down 30 points in the 5 minutes to go in the fourth quarter. We're gonna play like we can still win, but it's not looking good.
Yeah. What do you think, Curry? Optimism, hope? Where are you on this? I know you're not optimistic. Are you hopeful?
I think there's a possibility for things to change, but I think the cost of things changing would be so great that it becomes unfathomable for most people, be they Black, brown, or white. People don't like anyone who thinks outside of what white people say they can think. We can't speak languages different than what white people understand, and we can't talk in traditions that they're not willing to listen to. So I think that if you're talking about philosophy, that makes the possibility of change very, very narrow. because there's a counteracting dynamic against what we're trying to do. And let's be honest, it's not like we could trust every Black and brown person either in the field, right? So we also have to worry about the neo-colonial, the neoliberal careers elements, given the projects that we're pursuing. On the other hand, things do change. They don't change for the better necessarily, but things do change. But what I'm emphasizing isn't just the radicality or provocativeness of the claim, but I think that we've all had conversations at conferences about Black and brown folks that have spent their whole lives trying to make a difference in these fields, who have given years of service to SAP, have given years of service to the APA, who've given years of service to SPEP, and we're still having the same conversation. And when I look at that, I say, by God, what does it mean to be a Black or brown philosopher? Because when you see white people die, you see a great memoriam to what they've accomplished or what they anticipated or tried to achieve. When our people die, you barely hear a whisper celebrating their life, much less their contributions to the field. Because the idea is, no matter how hard you work, your contributions will never be worth as much to the majority of white people as it is to the minority of Black people and brown folks. And again, I think these are conversations that people don't want to have. I think they're conversations that we're told not to have because we won't get jobs. And if that's going to be the dynamic, yeah, I mean, I disagree with Cornell, but I love him to death. But I don't know much of what the distinction means. Is there some indeterminate future that we can't account for that will be different than the present? Absolutely. But human action, because we're so low in numbers, doesn't change that. And the reality of the situation is that, given the crumbs that white people have set out for us in the field, we'll fight each other over a job before we actually support each other over an idea or a project. So we have to be very real about how the structure of white supremacy has incentivized division between our groups, division within our groups, right? Because you have the same 5 or 6 Black or brown folk fighting for the same job with no other options, teaching adjunct, like this is what they do. And then when you see these aggressive, right, papers and ideologies against each other, right? Vote for Latina feminism over, machismo, vote for Black feminism over Black men, liberate, da 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 da. These are projects to get employed. These are appealing to recognition by white people. These are not interested in what's happening in our communities. And we fight each other because we have to fight for the crumbs they're willing to give us. And I think all of this is a dead end. And, again, we're not trying to have that conversation because it would upset too many white people. But until we start getting real about our actual dynamics and the practices of oppression within our fields, I feel that we're just going to keep going through this cycle over and over again. And we're going to keep spending our careers until the next group of people come along and ask the exact same questions and ask why there hasn't been any progress yet either.
Well, I want to thank you both for your time today to unpack some of this. We could go on for quite a long time with a lot of this, but I appreciate that you've been able to share your experiences with the Academy and with your own work with us to help us understand a little bit about this. So thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you. This was a real pleasure. This is great. It's always an honor, Professor Curry.
Indeed.
Oh, sir, I'm a big fan of yours.
I'm a big fan of both you guys.
And thank you all too for tuning in and listening in. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them down below. You can also find the Inares Project on social media, on Twitter, on Instagram, and on Facebook. You can also find us at our website, which is inaresproject.org. We also have some of our podcast audio on SoundCloud, but let us know what you think. Share with us your views. And tell us a little bit about what you think about the possibilities of liberatory imagination coming from the U.S. Academy and the possibilities of racial justice. Thank you both, and hopefully we get a chance to continue these discussions elsewhere.